to Parapsychology Foundation Presents Book Expo 2016. As you know, we're on our second day of the conference, and we're about to have a presentation from Dr. Stephen Braude, who is here. And I'm going to move over to his biography slide. You can read the slide. And I'm just going to say a couple of things. He's an emeritus professor of philosophy and former chair of the department at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and editor-in-chief of the Journal of Scientific Exploration, past president of the Parapsychological Association, I think multiple times, and recipient of several grants and fellowships, including from the National Endowment for the Humanities and Bial Foundation in Portugal. More than 60 philosophical essays in these journals, and 6 books, all of which I highly recommend for being clearly written and very well argued and good solid books on the field. Today we're going to hear about his recent book, Crimes of Reason on Mind, Nature, and the Paranormal. This brings together expanded and updated versions of some of his best previously published essays, along with new essays written specifically for the book, variety of topics, and we'll let him take you through what that's about, and we'll hear more about the process and the reception of the book as well. And I just wanted to show you, let me pop past this, that at the end of this PowerPoint, which you can download from the course schedule, we have links to buy the book from Roman and Littlefield, the publisher, from Amazon, and his own homepage from UMBC. And this I suggest that you definitely check out, because we always have a piano at the Parapsychological Association conferences for Steve Braude, who is an excellent jazz pianist. So Steve, here is your PowerPoint. Let's see if there it is. It's all loaded up. And I'm going to get out of your way, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Nan. If you ever want a job as my publicist, just have your people call my people.
No problem.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. Let me tell you about this totally unaffordable book. Wait a minute, let me see if I can do this. Right. So it's a collection of essays. I'm at that stage in my career where I have enough previously published stuff that I can bring it together. And I wanted to bring together a bunch of essays, both new essays and previously published ones, which I expanded and updated. These are essays that is, the published ones are some of those that I consider to be my best. And the major themes of these essays were, first of all, the poverty of mechanistic theories in the behavioral and life sciences. And what I mean by mechanistic theory, if you look at the bottom of this slide, it's a theory that explains the systems or structures function entirely in terms of the operations or the interactions or the organization of its component parts. So this is a kind of vertical explanation, or explanation by analysis. It's standard form of explanation in the physical sciences, and many behavioral scientists filled with physics envy think that they must explain observable or behavioral phenomena the same way. And one of the themes in the book, recurrent themes in the book, is that many scientists, or most scientists probably, believe that this kind of vertical or explanation by analysis can't go on indefinitely, that sooner or later we have to come to some primitive or foundational phenomena. And at that point, it no longer makes sense to ask how the phenomena occur. That's simply the way the universe works, and nothing at a deeper level explains why. That there have to be some fundamental regularities in nature. Now that I actually think is an okay thing to believe. But what many scientists believe in addition to that is that wherever these fundamental or primitive phenomena are, they're always at the level of the very small, that is, the atomic or subatomic level, or the neurophysiological level, or the chemical level, or something like that, but never at the level of behavior, at the observable level. Now that, I think, is not only questionable, I think it's false. I think there are good reasons, philosophical reasons, for rejecting that. And it's not an empirically established fact, it's just an assumption. And I call it the small is beautiful assumption. It infects many areas of parapsychological theorizing in psychology, especially in cognitive science. And So that's one of the themes that I attack repeatedly in the book. It has to do with my attack on memory trace theory. It has to do with my attack on Sheldrake's theory of morphogenesis and a number of other points that I raise in the book. So connected with that, another theme of the book, Crimes of Reason, has to do with the nature of psychological explanation and what it means to explain behavior, and various unappreciated strategies, certainly in the academic community, unappreciated, that I think are required to understand behavior. This is a very complex topic. I doubt that we'll get into what exactly it means here, but part of what I do in the book is to try to explain what I think is involved in understanding behavior, and in particular to attack the idea that in order to understand a person's behavior, we have to understand the states that emitted it or caused it. I think understanding behavior is a much more interesting process and a much richer process than you'd ever believe from seeing what goes on in cognitive science. Connected with all of that is my discussion of the nature of dissociation. In fact, there are 2 papers in the book having to do with dissociation. And connected with that are some more general considerations about the nature and limits of human abilities. My direct discussion of that arose out of a presidential address I gave to the Parapsychological Association, and then in a revised version to the International Remote Viewing Association. So I think we really don't have a firm grip on what it is to be a human ability or the varieties of human abilities. There's so much we don't understand about what human abilities are. Nevertheless, a lot of research in parapsychology and the behavioral science proceeds as if we have this understanding, and that's just utter nonsense. So that's one of the topics I address in the book. And then, of course, no book by Braude, I suppose, would be complete without an attack on the sleaziness of skeptical criticism of psi research. So there's a lot I have to say about that. And also, actually, about connections between the sleaziness of attacks on psi research and the sleaziness of attacks on research in dissociation as well. So moving right along. You're probably wondering what sort of insanity motivated me to produce this book. Well, first of all, I mean, I gather part of this whole webinar is to give those of you who are attending some guidance as to what to do in your own research. So you need to understand that this is not the sort of project which young scholars are going to be in a position to undertake, because it's the kind of project that you can only undertake after you've published quite a lot. So I think it's unlikely that the audience here is going to have that kind of benefit from what I have to say, unless you manage to remember all of this when you're very much later in your careers. But as I said, the idea was to bring together some of what I feel are my best essays, which, although they're related, had been widely scattered in quite different sorts of venues. And I wanted to supplement them with new essays which hopefully enhance the shared themes. So, you know, there are themes that were shared by all these essays which would have been much more difficult to discern if you had read them in their widely scattered incarnations. But when you bring them all together, I think the connections become much clearer and more valuable. So what are the essays? I hear you cry. Oh, there's more. Wait. I've already said some of this, but let's say it again. The individual essays remain self-contained. You can read them on their own. You don't have to read the others to get something out of them. But I do think they now reinforce one another in a way that would have been difficult to manage, or at least to figure out, if you had only read them in their previous and widely scattered locations. So there are 3 reasons, really, for doing the book. One was to highlight connections between some of these essays I do consider among my best, but which appeared over long stretches of time in quite different venues. And to update those essays as necessary. For example, to consider the relevance of the latest research to my views on memory and dissociative creativity. There has been some research, not necessarily progress, but some research on memory and dissociation since I wrote the original versions of these essays. So I wanted to make them more relevant to the state of the debate right now. And I wanted to develop further the philosophical threads running through the earlier essays and the new material that I wrote explicitly for this volume. That mostly concerns my essay on folk psychology and how we explain behavior. So I think now we get to the table of contents. Yes, indeed. So the first essay is about memory trace theory. You know, it's an almost unquestioned assumption in the behavioral sciences that we have to explain memory in terms of physical modifications left presumably in the brain by previous events, and that it's the triggering of these memory traces that explains how memory works. I actually think that view is not only false, I think it actually literally makes no sense, that it relies on a number of deeply buried philosophical assumptions that when you bring them up to the surface, you see really how silly they are. And so it's not a stupid view, memory trace theory. It's a nonsensical view, but it's deep nonsense. It's the kind of nonsense that is actually very easy to make if you're not clear about your assumptions. So the trick is to bring the assumptions up to the surface where you can see what the problems are. And when you do that, it turns out that memory trace theory is as crude and simplistic as Plato's suggestion that memory works analogously to impressions in wax. Then I move on to Rupert's view on morphogenesis and a new science of life. I actually think the book is very valuable and exceptionally interesting, but I think Rupert's theory of morphogenesis is just standard mechanistic theorizing, and he doesn't realize that he's doing exactly the sort of thing that he's criticizing. And it's because he doesn't really understand what a mechanistic theory is. So although I think Rupert has called attention to some very interesting regularities in nature about morphogenesis, he doesn't understand how it works, and his explanation, his attempt to explain it, turns out to make the same kinds of mistakes that sabotage memory trace theory. So the next article or paper is fairly philosophical. It's about how to explain behavior and why I reject explanations of behavior in terms of inner causes and prefer to explain them in terms of a space of possibility of action. There's no way to make sense of that in just a few words, so I'm not even going to try, but I consider it one of the best essays in the book, and I hope some of you, at least if you think you can afford the book, will actually take a look at it. Then there are two papers on dissociation, one just on the creative processes required to maintain a state of dissociation. For example, what's involved in maintaining a negative hallucination? If you're hypnotized to negatively hallucinate the chair in front of you, what do you have to do to maintain that in the face of various other perceptions which tend to count against it? And then I go on to explain analogous processes in cases of multiple personality or dissociative identity disorder. The next paper also is more relentlessly philosophical, but it raises the issue of moral responsibility in the case of multiple personality, and the really interesting cases where one alter personality doesn't claim to know anything about crimes or offensive actions committed by other alter personalities. So there are some very interesting issues there about moral responsibility and the nature of dissociation, which I think were not handled very well by the mental health professionals who tried to address it. Then comes my former presidential address in seriously updated form about parapsychology and the nature of abilities, and speculations about what we mean by abilities and various attempts I make to discriminate different kinds of abilities and to introduce some taxonomic sophistication into our understanding of all of this. Essay number 7 has to do with some general thoughts on connections between parapsychology and religion, in particular about the idea that, which you may have heard, that you can't fool God, that sooner or later you're going to pay for your transgressions. there are various deistic ways of understanding that and various non-deistic ways of understanding that. And I try to look at the ways in which our cognitive psi abilities, ESP, and our psychokinetic parapsychological abilities might be relevant to understanding how we can affect the lives of other people or know about the lives of other people, and how that relates to the idea that you can't fool God or you can't get away with offensive or morally reprehensible actions. And also its relation to the efficacy of prayer. We know that prayers are not always answered, but sometimes they seem to be. So what's the connection between our psi abilities and these humdrum facts about the efficacy or the lack of efficacy of prayer? And then finally, I just get a lot of stuff off my chest in a new essay written for the book about what to do when you study parapsychology or dissociation and you get attacked for your interest in these particular topics. So I offer various kinds of advice to people like myself who others try to marginalize academically. I took a lot of abuse in my own career for my interest in parapsychology and also my interest in dissociation. And I think there's some advice in there that might be of value to newbies to the field. And also, I get to take some very satisfying swipes at various skeptics who I think deserve the swipes. The other thing you may want to know about this book is that I had some problems publishing it, which are not unprecedented. Originally, my editor at the University of Chicago Press was enthusiastic about this project, and he urged me to submit the manuscript, which he liked. But when he submitted it, as he had done before with my book, The Gold Leaf Lady, when he submitted it for approval by their editorial board, which is usually an easy matter, there was a skeptical biologist on the panel who ruled against it, just as a matter of principle, saying no book on parapsychology should be published. And this despite the fact that the press had already published my Gold Leaf Lady book. So there was nothing he could do. There was no way he could, given the way things work at University of Chicago Press, there was no way he could really overturn that decision. So the book was scuttled. Fortunately, my editor at Rowman and Littlefield, who had already published several of my books, was happy to add another book to their Braude collection. Unfortunately, they've offered it at a prohibitive price given their stupid business model of selling first to libraries at exorbitant prices. I still haven't been able to get them to bring it out as an affordable paperback, but I'm working on it. It's worth noting that my adventure with the University of Chicago Press is similar to what Michael Grosso recently experienced with Oxford University Press with his book on Joseph of Cupertino. He had gotten to the last stages of publication of that book, and they took exception to the book because it was more sympathetic than they were comfortable with evidence in parapsychology, with evidence of Joseph's levitations. So, like myself, Michael found a more welcome home with Rowman and Littlefield, and it's a great book. So that's the story there. I don't know where we go from here, Nan, so please join back and tell me what we do next.
Well, let me pull up our list of questions and see if we left any out. Sorry. We could get back to this one. How did you choose the essays that you chose for the book?
Well, in part because I really liked them. I thought they were among my most important. They were ones that people were reading or either asking for a lot. And, you know, in my seniority, I look back at my career and think, well, what am I happiest about what I've written in the past? I mean, my books are still out there, but there were some papers that dealt with material that hadn't been addressed exactly in my books. And so I just wanted to bring together stuff that I was particularly pleased with and thought still had some merit. and which actually mutually reinforced one another and wouldn't have been as effective if they had just remained in their separate locations in various journals.
I think that's a great strategy. There's a couple of new comments here, so before we get to the reception of the book, Cheryl Lee was wondering, are you conducting any new studies into PK, and have you given up on the Felix group?
I think the Felix group may have given up on me since my latest JSE paper on Kai and the former circle leader Jochen's firsthand testimony of how he caught Kai cheating and seances I had nothing to do with. Kai has unfriended me on Facebook, and my guess is at least no time soon will he be willing to work with me again. But I consider myself a supporter of Kai. I don't make a big deal out of the fact that he has cheated. I think there are ways of investigating his easiest to investigate phenomena, which are primarily table levitations, if only he would let me do it under proper conditions. So I'm willing to work with him again. In the meantime, I've been investigating a subject in Argentina who doesn't cheat, has no aspirations of being a spiritist guru or even a public figure, who works in bright light and who makes tables rise, not fully levitate though. I'm not sure how much farther he wants to go with all of this. There already has been an article in the JSE on this subject, RAL. I've since been to Buenos Aires to work with him myself, and there will be an article forthcoming in JSE about additional work that's been done with RAL. So he's a good subject. How far I can go with that remains to be seen, but nothing else planned at the moment. And what's next? I suppose you want me to address that. I haven't a clue what's next. And actually, I like to take a little break from doing this kind of work. I'm busier in my retirement than I was ever busy before. I wanted to be making some music in my retirement. That hasn't been happening. So we'll see how it goes. At the moment, the research community won't let me alone, and I suppose I should just pay attention to this kind of natural arc and go with it. Then eventually, time will arise for me to take care of music.
Well, we're delighted that you're doing so much with Thinking Aloud, the new Thinking Aloud channel on YouTube, because those are great interviews. And I was happy to hear when we were talking the other day that you're going to turn the tables on Jeff Mishlove and interview him about PK.
Just did that yesterday.
Marvelous.
And I'll be doing some more interviews with Jeff on my book, Immortal Remains. It does help that we both live here in Vegas.
But they're really valuable, really valuable. Margaret had asked a little earlier, what are your thoughts on dissociation and psi?
Well, ever since the days of Mesmer, we know that it appears that dissociated subjects seem to manifest some previously unrecognized psi ability. So Mesmer's magnetized patients were demonstrating a kind of surprising lucidity. They could diagnose illness in others. They could predict future states of affairs or seem to know what was going on at a distance. And so the connection between dissociative states and psi has been recognized since that time. And when I was very deeply involved in the community of mental health professionals, when I was writing my book, First Person Plural, lots of clinicians would come up to me and tell me, confide in me really, about apparent psychic episodes they were having with their patients. And that just connects with what's been known about psi in the therapeutic or psychoanalytic setting for some time. And if you're interested in that, I suggest you read Jewel Eisenbud's book, Psi and Psychoanalysis, or his book, Parapsychology and the Unconscious. Are we there?
Yeah, hold on. I had to turn my audio back on. Shirley is following up on her question about the Felix group and saying, I've often thought the table levitation aspect of the Felix group sittings was more due to the group's PK. Couldn't you try table levitation sittings without Kai?
It's not my impression that it's due more to the group PK, although I'm sure that the other sitters can either enhance or suppress it. Kai seems to be the prime mover, and that wouldn't be unprecedented. That's how the subject Ariel was uncovered in Buenos Aires. The Parapsychological Association there in Buenos Aires was trying some group sittings, and they were getting some dramatic table movements. And they found out by a kind of process of elimination that the table only moved when Ariel was present. And it was then found that Ariel could do this just on his own. So my guess is Kai is really the main cause here, though I don't think you can ever eliminate the additional influence, positive or negative, of the other people there.
Hiram had asked, could you share one or more swipes at skeptics in organized skepticism? Basically, tell us what you really think.
Oh, boy. Well, you know, one of the standard sleazy tactics of skeptics is to generalize from the weakest cases, to indulge in straw man reasoning. And a good example of that is in the study of hypnosis, is what Nicholas Spanos did, claiming that hypnosis is not a genuine altered state, that it's a form of social compliance, a role-playing, an attempt of some kind to satisfy the usually unstated demands of the hypnotist. And he supported that kind of argument by focusing on the sorts of dissociative experiences that are most easy to simulate if you want to. For example, dealing with the kind of pain that could be induced by sticking your hand in ice water. But it seems to me if you really want to understand just how much of an altered state hypnosis is, a genuine altered state, you don't look at that. You look at, for example, Esdale's studies of hypnotic anesthesia. Esdale in India was doing major surgeries under hypnosis. He was amputating limbs. He was removing 100-pound scrotal tumors. There was a lot of elephantiasis in India at the time. He was removing great toenails by the roots and no reaction to pain. Now, when someone has a limb amputated or scrotal tumor amputated and doesn't show any signs of pain under hypnosis, that's not role-playing. That's a paradigm example of an altered state. So that would be one kind of example.
As a follow-up, Gonzalo is saying, how would you address the problem of this sleaziness of skeptical attacks on research?
You point out how shabby it is. You show what's wrong with it, just as I did with this example about Spanos. Or you look at the sorts of things many people have said about D.D. Hume. I mean, Trevor Hall wrote this absolutely shabby book about D.D. Hume, where he tries to focus only on, only on the weakest pieces of evidence. He spends about a quarter of the book on one of the most poorly documented demonstrations in Hume's career, this alleged levitation out the window of Ashley House and back in through another window. It occurred in darkness. There are really good experiments that William Crookes and others did with Hume, which are much more relevant and much more important. That would be another example. Peter Lamont wrote a terrible book on D.D. Hume, where he actually tries to deal with the cases that matter, but, and this is inexcusable for somebody who claims to be a historian, he got the facts wrong. So that's the kind of thing that I think needs to be pointed out. You just point it out. You show how shabby the argumentation really is.
Well, and it's also especially in dare I say peace case, there's motivated, there's a worldview before the actual historical research starts, and that makes it if you don't identify your own biases before you start to do the research, it's entirely possible you're going to make those kinds of mistakes, and that's really not good as an academician.
Absolutely.
It's a bad thing.
It's funny you should mention that. I'm writing my editorial for the next issue of the JSE, and it deals precisely with that topic, how biases with respect to parapsychology cut two ways. And it's a double-edged sword to appeal to biases in testimony. I mean, usually when people discuss bias in eyewitness testimony in parapsychology, they try to point out how witnesses of paranormal phenomena are just biased to see the miraculous or to see something paranormal. And while that may be true in many cases, it's mostly irrelevant in the cases that matter, because in the cases that matter, the conditions of observation were so good that they simply swamp whatever temptation there might have been to give biased testimony. But the other thing is that many critics of parapsychology have offered false testimony about what happened in many cases where others claim that phenomena occurred. And this negatively biased testimony needs to be revealed and exposed too.
Mm-hmm. Yesterday, Sophia Weaver was talking about how well researched Frana Kluski was, and her book, of course, has brought a lot of that out of the Polish literature, where those of us who don't read Polish couldn't get at it. But she was also mentioning how similar the structure of his phenomena was to, say, Andreasen and other physical mediums, and how that's another point of evidence, this over cultures over time, the structural similarity.
It's true. There is a difference, though, between the evidence for mediumship and the evidence for, say, poltergeist, because in mediumship there was already a kind of tradition handed down from the very beginnings with the Fox sisters about what conditions were necessary for the phenomena to occur. So already rituals were established and various beliefs were inculcated about what facilitates, at least, the phenomena if it's not necessary for it. Whereas in the poltergeist literature, going back at least as far as the 16th century, there are independent accounts where there was no tradition of poltergeist beliefs. There was no common literature that people had access to. Nevertheless, people were reporting in quite different sorts of contexts and different cultures and widely separated accounts the raining of stones and excrement inside a house where there was a poltergeist attack. I think those kinds of similarities are very interesting, or the slow and gentle trajectories of transported objects.
I was just going to wait and see what Cal was typing, but before that, let's go back to a comment that Margaret made a little earlier. She was wondering what your reaction is to the reports of Psi with advanced meditators and that research line that's going on at the moment.
With advanced meditators?
Meditators, yeah.
Well, see, that's usually my invitation to be the spokesperson for the dark side. You know, I've often been invited to speak at various kinds of New Age conferences where people are very interested in getting together to meditate for world peace or to focus on generating healing thoughts. And I feel I have to point out that there's no force that can be used exclusively for the good. So once we open this Pandora's box of allowing for the possibility of this kind of influence, and I think we need to do that, then we need to be ready to entertain the possibility of things like hexing and the evil eye and psychokinetic vendettas.
I often thought it was interesting back in the day when we were at Edinburgh that part of Carolyn Watt's research was focused on blocking in a female's environment the influence that the sender was trying to send, which was interesting in two ways. One, that she was acknowledging that if it can be used for good, it can be used for evil, but also that for a person who has a public persona as more of a skeptic than I think she really is. It showed that she felt this was an efficacious, that it's possible to have that kind of influence in those kinds of setups. But I think it's important that it's like what Carlos always says, it's important for the field to cover everything, and politically that's very difficult to do even inside.
There's also a problem for healing studies. I mean, when you consider if you're working with people or even lower animal forms, what do you do for a control group? I mean, do you withhold healing intentions?
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of a similar problem with some of the clinical trials work. Where's the point how can you get an actual control group without leaving people untreated in the way they did in the old
Exactly.
syphilis study back in the day. So going back to mediumship, Cal was making the point, Cal Cooper, our next speaker, is in the classroom now, and he said, that's a great point you were making with the Fox sisters. Many critics fully blame them for the phenomena, and yet it's almost never mentioned that after the initial phenomena occurred, the girls were made to leave the house with their mother, and the phenomena continued in the house and was responsive to their father and the neighbor.
Right. Well, I mean, the case of the Fox sisters is just one of many that has been described misleadingly and very conveniently by those who wanted to just debunk physical phenomena generally.
Yeah. Gonzalo was asking, as a philosopher, how do you see the evidence for psi phenomena becoming recognized, disproved?
I'd like to say I'm optimistic that will happen, but I haven't seen any significant change over the many decades I've been at this. So I can't really be optimistic. But then I'm a philosopher. I'm a jaded philosopher. What do you want?
Sorry, 1 sec. I think Gonzalo enjoyed that answer. What do you think it would take, though, to do that, to get over that proof hump?
I don't know. I don't know what it would take to get any individual person to accept the phenomena. I mean, one of the things that I think many people in parapsychology would say is that it helps to be initiated. But, you know, Nan, you and I are members of the same listservs, and there are people who are seasoned psi researchers who themselves aren't convinced about the reality of the phenomena. So I don't think you can reason people out of positions they haven't been reasoned into. I think the actual conditions that lead to a belief in the phenomena are very idiosyncratic and maybe just ultimately mysterious.
Actually, I've left a couple of listservs because of the opposite problem of people that I think believe too much on the basis of what they consider to be the evidence, and then can't produce, can't really talk about that evidence. It's more of an emotional, and I believe that the phenomena exist personally, but at a scientific level, there are areas in the field that don't seem to have enough evidence even for me to say, well, scientifically we're there already. And then others, I will say that, so it's a mixed bag.
Well, also people have different ideas about what counts as legitimate evidence. There are many within the field who think that only laboratory evidence can be acceptable scientifically, which I think is just plain stupid. Most of what we know about the world we knew before scientific experiments were done. I mean, if you want to understand most of the interesting things human beings can do, you'll never see those things exhibited under laboratory conditions, yet we know that they occur. So I'd say psi abilities are on a par with that. I had another point I was going to make, but I also had a senior moment, so I don't know what that is.
Well, I agree with you definitely that not taking into account other types of evidence other than experimental is a big mistake. I had to marry Carlos to find that out, but I agree that there's so much out there that is very evidential in and of itself. So Brian Williams and a couple of other people are writing, and if anybody else has any comments or questions, we're at the 48-minute mark for the total time we've been sitting here, and we'd like to wrap up by about 2:45, which is about 8 minutes away. Maurice is saying, do you think most paranormal phenomena supposedly indicative of survival can be explained by supersize?
Well, in principle, I think they can. Whether they should be or not is the big question. The problem, as Michael Sudduth has been pointing out, is that when people argue in favor of the survival hypothesis, they usually strip the survival hypothesis they're defending of all its undefended assumptions about what the evidence should look like, and then attack the superpsi hypothesis or the living agent psi hypothesis on the basis of various assumptions it makes about what the evidence would look like if psi is operating. So on a purely intellectual basis, I'd say it's almost impossible to make a case for either living agent psi or survival psi, although my position at the end of Immortal Remains is pretty much unchanged. It depends on what day you ask me. Some cases have more of an emotional tug than others, and there are some cases that I think are really personally quite impressive, but nothing yet close to the kind of slam dunk case that would absolutely, in my opinion, rule out living agent psi.
Thanks for that. Brian is saying perhaps some of the objections may not necessarily be about the evidence, but rather about the perception that little established theory for psi and how that little established theory exists for psi and how it seems to be beyond the phenomena, beyond conventional mainstream theoretical approaches. Would you respond to that?
Well, the mainstream theoretical approaches usually involve application of the small is beautiful assumption that you have to somehow break down the phenomena into lower level components and then show how the lower level components yield more or less as necessary and sufficient conditions the phenomenon in question. And I think the real problem here is an impoverished view of what proper scientific methodology is. I think we really need a plurality of methods, and we need to pay attention to something that Aristotle recognized, that is that different domains of investigation require different methodologies, different kinds of explanation, and that's as true today as it ever was.
Well, thanks, Stephen. This has been really excellent, as we expected. Is there anything more you'd like to say? We can probably take another 5 minutes or so if you'd like it. And if anyone else has any more comments or questions, please put them into the chat. What are you working on now? That's one thing. Did we go over that what you're working on now?
Well, sort of. That I've been investigating this guy, Ariel, in Buenos Aires, and I'm working on a report with my colleagues there about the latest experimental work done with Ariel. I have no other plans to be doing any more writing unless it's my book on suppositories. I started writing that years ago. It's called Up Yours, an illustrated history of suppositories. And I figured I needed to write a coffee table type book. So I used an illustrator, but this project got scuttled when the comedian Gallagher had a special on Showtime, and he was telling jokes about suppositories, including some that I had thought of independently. He had a whole bit about suppositories with nuclear warheads. And I had a section of my book on suppositories and espionage, which included some stuff about suppositories with nuclear warheads. He didn't get my gag about the suppository, which kills its victims but leaves gold fillings and contact lenses intact.
Oh my goodness.
But I firmly believe that the time has come to insert the suppository into its proper place in history.
I'm thinking maybe playing the piano is really where you should be going. I'm sorry for that. Well, thank you very much for this really informative talk on your book. Thank you for agreeing to do this for us, and we hope you'll be around the Parapsychology Foundation's online stuff in the future. I'm going to dip back into the chat for a second because Shirley is wondering if you're still in contact.
No, I lost touch with Katie after Bert Schwartz died, and I really don't know how to reach her now. And last I heard, even from Bert, was that she had been in a protracted drunken stupor with her husband. I mean, it's a toxic relationship that they have. So I don't know what's going on.
Well, I don't even know how to describe these last two notes of the conversation. On those notes, thank you again very much, and thank you everybody for joining us. And let me get over to the end here. Oh, as you know, we've got the links to the book, so you can buy the book and to his biography page and jazzphilosopher.com. And our next up is Cal Cooper on Telephone Calls from the Dead at 3 p.m. Eastern, and then at 4 p.m. Eastern we'll be doing the closing session and telling you some little things about what's going on at the PF and what's coming up next. So thanks so much, Steve. It's been
bye. Thank you.
And thank you everybody for joining us. See you at 3 p.m. Eastern.
Hi there, I'm Lisette Coley. I'm president of Parapsychology Foundation. So welcome to our YouTube channel. We have lots to look at, so please check out our videos. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.